Now that brings us to the second illustration, and Paul spends a lot more time on the second illustration. The second illustration comes from the world of horticulture. If the root is holy, so are the branches. And here Paul describes Israel as an olive tree. And please note this. Paul describes Israel as an olive tree. Now, Paul didn't come up with this illustration himself. Israel is described as an olive tree in the Old Testament. And so Israel is the olive tree, and Paul mentions the root of the olive tree. Again, look what he says. If the root of the olive tree is holy, so are the branches. So if the olive tree is Israel, what is the root of the olive tree? What is the root representing in the illustration? If the tree is Israel, the root of Israel is the covenants and the promises that God made, going back to Abraham, the founder of the nation, right? The promises and covenants that God made to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and then the covenants he made with Moses and with Israel, and the promises that he made. That's the root of Israel. That's the source of Israel. When God called Abraham to leave Ur of the Chaldees and go to a land that he would show him, and God promised Abraham that he would make of him a great nation, Israel, and that through Abraham all the nations of the world would be blessed, because through Abraham would come the Messiah. That's the root of Israel. The covenant that God made with Abraham, and then with Isaac, and then with Jacob, and the promises that God made to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and the giving of the promises, and the law, and so forth. God gave those things to Israel. That's the root. That's the source of God's relationship with Israel. Now watch what he says in verse 17. Speaking of the olive tree of Israel, and if some of the branches were broken off, and you, again he's speaking to Gentile believers, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree. There's a few things I want you to note with verse 17. Notice that it says, some of the branches were broken off. Not all of the branches. God has not completely cut off Israel because of her unbelief. Only some of Israel was cut off. Those Israelites who rejected Jesus Christ. And here in verse 17, Gentile believers, which again I think describes most of us here, are described as a wild olive tree or wild olive branches. And you, being a wild olive tree, you were grafted in among them. Note that, we're grafted in among them. We haven't replaced them. We're grafted in with them, among them. The church has not replaced Israel. Gentile believers were grafted in among the Jewish believers into the olive tree of Israel. And now we, Gentile believers, get to partake of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Are you tracking with this? What is the root of the olive tree? Well, the covenants and the promises that God made first to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and the word that he gave to the children of Israel. We as Gentile Christians have been grafted into the olive tree of Israel. And we, again, notice that it says we are wild olive branches. And we've been grafted into the cultivated tree of Israel. And now because we've been grafted in and added in, now we get to partake of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. All of those Old Testament covenants and promises that God made in the Old Testament, we are nourished by those, and we are enriched by those, and we are strengthened by those. You know, there's a movement right now in churches to completely disconnect from the Old Testament. and have nothing to do with the Old Testament, that the Old Testament has nothing to offer us as New Testament Christians. No, that's the root and the fatness, right? That's the sap that nourishes us, that strengthens us, that enables us in our Christian faith. Now, here's the thing. Please don't let me lose you. If I haven't lost you already, stay with me. So he's describing Gentile believers as a wild olive branch from a wild olive tree grafted into a cultivated olive tree, which is Israel. In ancient times, you would never graft a wild olive branch into a cultivated tree. You would never do that. You would never graft a wild olive branch into a cultivated tree, because that wild olive branch would not bear fruit if you added it to a cultivated tree. Grafting a wild olive branch into a cultivated tree would weaken the cultivated tree, or even bring harm to the cultivated tree, and would diminish the quality of the fruit that the cultivated tree was producing. And so it was never done. You never did this. In fact, if you look down at verse 24, Paul tells us grafting a wild olive branch into a cultivated tree is contrary to nature. It's against nature to do this. Again, because it's not going to bear fruit, and it's only going to bring harm to the cultivated tree and diminish the quality of the cultivated tree to bring this wild olive branch that is producing wild olives that you can't really eat, bad fruit, and to bring it now into a cultivated tree. Now, they would take a branch from a cultivated tree and bring it into a wild olive tree, and it would improve the quality of the wild tree. But you didn't do it the other way. You wouldn't bring a wild branch into a cultivated tree. It just wasn't done. It was against nature. It was contrary to nature.